inexplicable either in terms of higher universals or in terms of the components participating in the con. 22. The speculative scheme. Crescents. The analysis of the components abstracts from the concrescence. The sole appeal is to intuition. The categories of existence. There are 8 categories of existence. Actual entities, also termed actual occasions, are final realities, or res verae. Prehensions, are concrete facts of relatedness. Nexus, plural of nexus, are public matters of fact. Subjective forms, are private matters of fact. Eternal objects, are pure potentials for the specific determination of fact, are forms of definiteness. Propositions, are matters of fact in potential pre-determination, or impure potentials for the specific determination of matters of fact, are theories. Multiplicities, are pure disjunctions of diverse entities. Contrasts, are modes of synthesis of entities in one prehension, are patterned entities. Among these 8 categories of existence, actual entities and eternal objects stand out with a certain extreme finality. The other types of existence have a certain intermediate character. The 8th category includes an indefinite progression of categories, as we proceed from contrasts to contrasts of contrasts, and on indefinitely to higher grades of contrasts. Categories of explanation. There are 27 categories of explanation. That the actual world is a process, and that the process is the becoming of actual entities. Thus actual entities are creatures. They are also termed actual occasions. That in the becoming of an actual entity, the potential unity of many entities in disjunctive diversity actual and non-actual acquires the real unity of the one actual entity, so that the actual entity is the real concrescence of many potentials. That in the becoming of an actual entity, novel prehensions, nexus. Subjective forms, propositions, multiplicities, and contrasts also become, but there are no novel eternal objects. That the potentiality for being an element in a real concrescence of many entities into one actuality is the one general metaphysical character attaching to all entities, actual and non-actual, and that every item in its universe is involved in each concrescence. In other words, it belongs to the nature of a being, that it is a potential for every becoming. This is the principle of relativity. That no 2 actual entities originate from an item 34 universe, though the difference between the 2 universes only consists in the categorical scheme. 23 Some actual entities, included in one and not in the other, and in the subordinate entities which each actual entity introduces into the world. The eternal objects are the same for all actual entities. The nexus of actual entities in the universe correlate to a concrescence it is termed, the actual world correlate to that concrescence. That each entity in the universe of a given concrescence can, so far as its own nature is concerned, be implicated in that concrescence in one or other of many modes, but in fact it is implicated only in one mode. That the particular mode of implication is only rendered fully determinate by that concrescence, though it is conditioned by the correlate universe. This indetermination, rendered determinate in the real concrescence, is the meaning of potentiality. It is a conditioned indetermination, and is therefore called a real potentiality. Be that an eternal object can be described only in terms of its potentiality for ingression into the becoming of actual entities, and that its analysis only discloses other eternal objects. It is a pure potential. The term ingression refers to the particular mode in which the potentiality of an eternal object is realized in a particular actual entity, contributing to the definiteness of that actual entity. Be that two descriptions are required for an actual entity: A. One which is analytical of its potentiality for objectification in the becoming of other actual entities, and B. Another which is analytical of the process which constitutes its own becoming. The term objectification refers to the particular mode in which the potentiality of one actual entity is realized in another actual entity. It's that how an actual entity becomes constitutes what that actual entity is, plus so that the two descriptions of an actual entity are not independent. Its being is 35 constituted by its becoming. This is the principle of process. X that the first analysis of an actual entity into its most concrete elements discloses it to be a concrescence of prehensions which have originated in its process of becoming. All further analysis is an analysis of prehensions. Analysis in terms of prehensions is termed division. Sheet that every prehension consists of three factors: A. The subject, which is prehending, namely, the actual entity in which that prehension is a concrete element; B. The datum, which is prehended; C. The subjective form, which is how that subject prehends the datum. Prehensions of actual entities, i.e., prehensions whose data involve actual entities, are termed physical prehensions, and prehensions of eternal objects are termed conceptual prehensions. Consciousness is not necessarily involved in the subjective forms of either type of prehension. Sheet that there are two species of prehensions: A. Positive prehensions, which are termed feelings, and B. Negative prehensions, which are said to eliminate from feeling. Negative prehensions also have subjective forms. A negative prehension holds its datum as inoperative in the 24. The speculative scheme. Progressive concrescence of prehensions constituting the unity of the subject. Sheet that there are many species of subjective forms, such as emotions, valuations, purposes, adversions, aversions, consciousness, etc. xiv, that a nexus is a set of actual entities and the unity of the relatedness constituted by their prehensions of each other, or what is the same thing conversely expressed constituted by their objectifications in each other. Xb that a proposition is the unity of certain actual entities and their potentiality for forming a nexus, with its potential relatedness partially defined by certain eternal objects which have the unity of one complex eternal 36 object. The actual entities involved are termed the logical subjects. The complex eternal object is the predicate. XVI that a multiplicity consists of many entities, and its unity is constituted by the fact that all its constituent entities severally satisfy at least one condition which no other entity satisfies. Every statement about a particular multiplicity can be expressed as a statement referent either A to all its members severally, or B to an indefinite sum of its members severally, or C as a denial of one of these statements. Any statement, incapable of being expressed in this form, is not a statement about a multiplicity, though it may be a statement about an entity closely allied to some multiplicity, i.e., systematically allied to each member of some multiplicity. XVII, that whatever is a datum for a feeling has a unity is felt. Thus the many components of a complex datum have a unity. This unity is a contrast of entities. In a sense, this means that there are an endless number of categories of existence, since the synthesis of entities into a contrast in general produces a new existential type. For example, a proposition is, in a sense, a contrast. For the practical purposes of human understanding, it is sufficient to consider a few basic types of existence, and to lump the more derivative types together under the heading of contrasts. The most important of such contrasts is a affirmation-negation contrast in which a proposition and a nexus obtain synthesis in one datum, the members of the nexus being the logical subjects of the proposition. XVII, that every condition to which the process of becoming conforms in any particular instance, it has its reason either in the character of some actual entity in the actual world of that concrescence, or in the character of the subject which is in process of concrescence. This category of explanation is termed the ontological principle. It could also be termed the principle of efficient, 37, and final causation. This ontological principle means that actual entities are the only reasons, so that to search for a reason is to search for one or more actual entities. It follows that any condition to be satisfied by one actual entity in its process expresses a fact either about the real internal constitutions of some other actual entities, or about the subjective aim conditioning that process. The categorical scheme. 25. The phrase, real internal constitution, is to be found in Locke's essay concerning human understanding 3:15, and thus the real internal, but generally in substances unknown constitution of things, whereon their discoverable qualities depend, may be called their essence. Also the terms prehension and feeling are to be compared with the various significations of Locke's term idea. But they are adopted as more general and more neutral terms than idea is used by Locke, who seems to restrict them to conscious mentality. Also the ordinary logical account of propositions expresses only a restricted aspect of their role in the universe, namely, when they are the data of feelings whose subjective forms are those of judgments. It is an essential doctrine in the philosophy of organism that the primary function of a proposition is to be relevant as a lure for feeling. For example, some propositions are the data of feelings with subjective forms such as to constitute those feelings to be the enjoyment of a joke. Other propositions are felt with feelings whose subjective forms are horror, disgust, or indignation. The subjective aim, which controls the becoming of a subject, is that subject feeling a proposition with the subjective form of purpose to realize it in that process of self-creation. 6. That the fundamental types of entities are actual entities, and eternal objects, and that the other types of entities only express how all entities of the two fundamental types are in community with each other, in the actual world. 38xx That to function means to contribute determination to the actual entities in the nexus of some actual world. Thus the determinateness and self-identity of one entity cannot be abstracted from the community of the diverse functionings of all entities. Determination, as analyzable into definiteness and position, where definiteness is the illustration of select eternal objects, and position is relative status in a nexus of actual entities. XXI, an entity is actual when it has significance for itself. By this it is meant that an actual entity functions in respect to its own determination. Thus an actual entity combines self-identity with self-diversity. XXII, that an actual entity by functioning in respect to itself plays diverse roles in self-formation without losing its self-identity. It is self-creative, and in its process of creation transforms its diversity of roles into one coherent role. Thus, becoming is the transformation of incoherence into coherence, and in each particular instance ceases with this attainment. XXIII, that this self-functioning is the real internal constitution of an actual entity. It is the immediacy of the actual entity. An actual entity is called the subject of its own immediacy. XXIV, the functioning of one actual entity in the self-creation of another actual entity is the objectification of the former for the latter actual entity. The functioning of an eternal object in the self-creation of an actual entity is the ingression of the eternal object in the actual entity. XXV, the final phase in the process of concrescence, constituting an 26. The speculative scheme. Actual entity is one complex, fully determinate feeling. This final phase is termed the satisfaction. It is fully determinate A as to its genesis, B as to its objective character for the transcendent creativity, and C as to its prehension positive or negative of every item in its universe. XXVI, each element in the genetic process of an actual 39 entity has one self-consistent function, however complex, in the final satisfaction. XXVII, in a process of concrescence, there is a succession of phases in which new prehensions arise by integration of prehensions in antecedent phases. In these integrations, feelings contribute their subjective forms and their data to the formation of novel integral prehensions, but negative prehensions contribute only their subjective forms. The process continues till all prehensions are components in the one determinate integral. Satisfaction. Section 3. There are 9 categorial obligations. The category of subjective unity. The many feelings which belong to an incomplete phase in the process of an actual entity, though unintegrated by reason of the incompleteness of the phase, are compatible for integration by reason of the unity of their subject. The category of objective identity. There can be no duplication of any element in the objective datum of the satisfaction of an actual entity, so far as concerns the function of that element in the satisfaction. Here, as always, the term satisfaction means the one complex fully determinate feeling which is the completed phase in the process. This category expresses that each element has one self-consistent function, however complex. Logic is the general analysis of self-consistency, the category of objective diversity. There can be no coalescence of diverse elements in the objective datum of an actual entity, so far as concerns the functions of those elements in that satisfaction. Coalescence here means the notion of diverse elements exercising an absolute identity of function, devoid of the contrasts inherent in their diversities. The category of conceptual valuation. From each physical feeling there is the derivation of a purely forty conceptual feeling whose datum is the eternal object determinant of the definiteness of the actual entity, or of the nexus, physically felt. The category of conceptual reversion. There is secondary origination of conceptual feelings with data which are partially identical with, and partially diverse from, the eternal objects forming the data in the first phase of the mental pole. The diversity is a relevant diversity determined by the subjective aim. Note that category IV concerns conceptual reproduction of physical feeling, and category V concerns conceptual diversity from physical feeling. The Kate-Boreal scheme. 27b. The category of transmutation. When, in accordance with category IV, or with categories IV and VT1 and the same conceptual feeling is derived impartially by a prehending subject from its analogous simplet physical feelings of various actual entities in its actual world, then, in a subsequent phase of integration of these simple physical feelings together with the derivate conceptual feeling, the prehending subject may transmute the datum of this conceptual feeling into a characteristic of some nexus containing those prehended actual entities among its members, or of some part of that nexus. In this way the nexus, or its part thus characterized, is the objective datum of a feeling entertained by this prehending subject. It is evident that the complete datum of the transmuted feeling is a contrast, namely, the nexus, as one, in contrast with the eternal object. This type of contrast is one of the meanings of the notion, qualification of physical substance by quality. This category is the way in which the philosophy of organism, which is an atomic theory of actuality, meets a perplexity which is inherent in all monadic cosmologies. Leibniz in his monadology meets the same difficulty by a theory of confused perception. But he fails to make clear how confusion originates. The category of subjective harmony. The Val 41 huations of conceptual feelings are mutually determined by the adaptation of those feelings to be contrasted elements congruent with the subjective aim. Category I and Category V jointly express a pre-established harmony in the process of concrescence of any one subject. Category I has to do with data felt, and Category V with the subjective forms of the conceptual feelings. This pre-established harmony is an outcome of the fact that no prehension can be considered an abstraction from its subject, although it originates in the process creative of its subject. The category of subjective intensity. The subjective aim, whereby there is origination of conceptual feeling, is O intensity of feeling A in the immediate subject, and F3 in the relevant future. This double aim at the immediate present and the relevant future is less divided than appears on the surface. For the determination of the relevant future, and the anticipatory feeling respecting provision for its grade of intensity, are elements affecting the immediate complex of feeling. The greater part of morality hinges on the determination of relevance in the future. The relevant future consists of those elements in the anticipated future which are felt with effective intensity by the present subject by reason of the real potentiality for them to be derived from itself. It's the category of freedom and determination. The concrescence of each individual actual entity is internally determined and is externally free. This category can be condensed into the formula, that in each concrescence whatever is determinable is determined, but that there is always. 28. The speculative scheme. A remainder for the decision of the subject superject of that concrescence. This subject superject is the universe in that synthesis, and beyond it there is nonentity. This final decision is the reaction of the unity of the whole to its own internal determination. This reaction is the final modification of emotion, appreciation, and purpose. But the decision 42 of the whole arises out of the determination of the parts, so as to be strictly relevant to it. Section IV. The whole of that discussion in the subsequent parts either leads up to these categories, of the four types, or is explanatory of them, or is considering our experience of the world in the light of these categories. But a few preliminary notes may be useful. It follows from the fourth category of explanation that the notion of complete abstraction is self-contradictory. For you cannot abstract the universe from any entity, actual or non-actual, so as to consider that entity in complete isolation. Whenever we think of some entity, we are asking, what is it fit for here? In a sense, every entity pervades the whole world, for this question has a definite answer for each entity in respect to any actual entity or any nexus of actual entities. It follows from the first category of explanation that becoming is a creative advance into novelty. It is for this reason that the meaning of the phrase, the actual world is relative to the becoming of a definite actual entity which is both novel and actual, relatively to that meaning, and to no other meaning of that phrase. Thus, conversely, each actual entity corresponds to a meaning of the actual world peculiar to itself. This point is dealt with more generally in categories of explanation E and P. An actual world is a nexus, and the actual world of one actual entity sinks to the level of a subordinate nexus in actual worlds beyond that actual entity. The first, the fourth, the 18th, and 27th categories state different aspects of one and the same general metaphysical truth. The first category states the doctrine in a general way, that every ultimate actuality embodies in its own essence what Alexander 3:43 terms, a principle of unrest, namely, its becoming. The fourth category applies this doctrine to the very notion of an entity. It asserts that the notion of an entity means an element contributory to the process of becoming. We have in this category the utmost generalization of the notion of relativity. The 18th category asserts that the obligations imposed on the becoming of any particular actual entity arise from the constitutions of other actual entities. The four categories of explanation, X to Xi constitute the repudia. 3 cf. Artistic Creation and Cosmic Creation, Proc. Brit. Acad. 1927, Volume 13. The Categorial Scheme. 29. Tion of the notion of vacuous actuality, which haunts realistic